Okay, welcome to the Economist Board for June 2024 for the Watch Report. I'm John Nelson with M&A, and I'm joined today by Keith Prather of Armada. Keith, it's another great day.
It is a great day. It is a great day. We're just right before July 4th and feeling all patriotic and, hope everyone's going to have a good and safe holiday. So,
Yeah, here we go. Okay, so in this video, we are going to provide some additional context to what's going on to the narrative that you'll see in the watch for those of you that subscribe. This particular one, we're going to focus on industrial production from manufacturing and the two key inputs into industrial production, so we understand what the flow of the raw materials are into it. For our subscribers, we're going to dive deeper into the subsectors of industrial production in a separate video. That's where we're going to hit aerospace, computers, electronics, machinery, and motor vehicles. Additionally, we're also going to hit a separate one on supply chain, so the transportation of the goods across the country. We'll have another video on housing starts and private non-residential construction, so you have an idea what's going on in the construction sector. And then finally, we're also going to take a look at a macroeconomic outlook. So lots of different information. We're going to try to keep these videos relatively short and hard-hitting. So with all that introduction, I'm going to shut up and we're going to go right to our first model. As I threatened, we're going to go into IPMAN and we're going to talk about this one. And Keith, as you and I were discussing, I'm assuming it's up on the board now, right?
it is. Yeah.
Okay, as you and I were discussing, a little bit surprising that this particular model started showing a little bit more strength than what we were suspecting. So it's still accepting the same general curve where you have a little bit of a rise, then a falling off, but this is showing about a single to a point to a point and a half increase index point wise at its peak. So if you look there in the first quarter of 2025, you can see where it starts to peak out. They're just above the 102, so probably right there at 102. Notice this is a really pretty broad, tight scale. We're only going from 92 to 106, so all those changes are exaggerated. Whereas before we were about, the 101 range. So we went up just a little bit. We're tailing off. The back end doesn't look as far as it was before. So that's kind of what it looks like for the next 18 months. Putting it into context over 18 months, you can still see it's still fairly positive, well above the trend line. But the trend line would keep us right around that 99 point. So, Keith, thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of weird things going on here with the model. You and I were talking offline about, how we feel about the actual forecast. And we had to keep coming back to the fact that this particular model is our oldest one. We've been doing this one for a number of years now, and we've trained the data over what, John, 24 years, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because this one is batting about 99% accuracy 1 month out. I think it was 99% almost 3 months out, but then even better, it's like 98% 6 months out. So it's giving us no reasons right now not to trust it from a data perspective, as long as the data inputs are accurate. And we have about 20 different data inputs that go into this model. So we're left with trying to explain what this model may be looking at, what it could be possibly forecasting that would send it to almost a post-Great Recession peak is kind of what it's predicting. So we got to think about that for a minute. Like a peak that we haven't seen since 2007. So this is just an interesting time. Now, it's not unprecedented because it's going to be very similar to what we saw in 2018. I think for those who were managing supply chains back in 2018, that tells you all you need to know. You remember how tough it was to get transportation. Raw materials were tightening up a little bit. Saw just a little bit of inflation, but largely the global supply chain was kind of keeping pace, and it was just a fantastic time for business overall. And there was a lot of optimism. The model here is kind of telling us that it feels a little more like 2018. So if that forecast holds, then that's going to be a pretty spectacular second half of the year. Um, in this inflation environment, it might create a few challenges. We may see transportation costs go up. You see raw material costs go up. It may give the Federal Reserve a bit of a headache just because of kind of how total output around the world is being managed at the moment. Um, but in general, I mean, there's nothing negative here. John, I kind of talk about a lot. I want to go way back up to the top for 1 second because you talked about the two different components that make up this measure. And there are two. One is basically the durable side of manufacturing,
Yep,
durable goods, which are long-lasting goods. But then there's also the non-durables, which are those who really quick consumables, food, clothing, shelter, or not shelter. We don't consume shelter, but food and clothing. I get so used to that narrative, right?
right.
Inflation, higher food, clothing, shelter. But it's food, clothing. It's going to be some of the pharmaceuticals, those things that we do consume on a weekly basis. And so it's showing those two different sides. And we know in the general economy right now, there are enough households kind of struggling a little bit that we see a little bit of a slowdown in what we call discretionary items, the discretionary spending. So we're seeing a little bit of pressure in furniture sales, and we're seeing a little bit of pressure, when we kind of look at sporting goods, and we're looking at some of those categories that are on the discretionary side, we see a little bit of slowdown, but we're kind of making up for that everywhere else. And so with inventories getting lean, a lot of manufacturers are kind of got their assembly lines reset, and so that global supply chain is starting to work, and we're seeing this improvement. So the last thing I'll end with is, we are seeing a little bit of corroboration in this data with what we got in at least one of the monthly manufacturing surveys from S&P Global. The
Hmm.
S&P Global survey showed a little bit of an uptick or a little bit of increase in June in the manufacturing PMI. I think it went from 51.3 to 51.6. That's not a lot, but at 51.6, it shows the manufacturing sector expanding and growing, which is kind of what the model's predicting.
Right.
So running a little bit contrary to what the ISM has. The ISM has a little more government information in their surveys, a little more in the government respondent side of things. And so a little more weakness there and showing manufacturing and contraction. But this national industrial production data and some of the other manufacturing measures that we see are showing it a little bit on the positive side. And of course, the model's very positive. So.
Okay, so let's look at the far end of the supply chain, at the primary metals coming into this. And, this has remained fairly flat. It's really flat now. It actually is a little bit of an improvement from last month, which kind of tapered off. So again, that's kind of building into this same narrative that you were just talking about to feed that growth. But overall, it's still kind of riding along that long-term trend line. So I'm not expecting anything crazy to happen with this particular model.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of discussion right now in the marketplace about copper prices, right? Copper prices are still hovering up around their second all-time high, but we see other commodity metals kind of doing a little bit better, right? We see a little bit less pricing pressure, in steel and steel components, and so all those other prices are kind of coming down a little bit. And it's kind of what the model is saying. The model is seeing a little bit of near-term pressure if you really look at where the actual is today
Mm-hmm.
and where it's forecasting over the next 2 to 3 months. That's a pretty good increase in raw material costs or the cost to produce primary metals. And a lot of that could be based on the back of higher copper prices, a little higher nickel prices. So I think we have a little bit of that. But as you said, long term, this is generally a downward trajectory. Most of it because we're still offshoring a lot of primary metal production, which will pull total U.S. industrial production for primary metals down a little bit because we're importing more of it, a lot more cross-border of these materials. So that downward trend is not surprising. So I think near term, what the model's telling us though is a pretty optimistic story. And
Mm-hmm.
John, it's kind of removed. Remember a couple months ago, we were looking at this big drop off and the back end of the model, looking out, way over the next 18 months, and some of that risk has now come back off. And so it's kind of falling back more in line with the long-term trend, which is a good story.
Sure. All right, let's start cutting and bending the metal. And there you go. This kind of also a little bit, I won't say it's really not changed all that much from the previous month. But again, it supports that story that maybe IPMAN is not so far out of whack.
Yeah, absolutely.
Growth.
Yeah, in the fabricated metal sector, obviously is dependent on all those other sectors of manufacturing. So it's going to be kind of interesting to look and see what we see in the automotive model and aerospace and machinery and some of those others that we'll cover in a different video. But generally you do see this positive upward trend overall for fabricated metals. And so for that whole industry, this is going to look like a really positive outlook. And then I know you're sorry.
Yeah, I'll jump for the long term. This is kind of, yeah, as you were saying, a positive upward trend in an industry that wasn't having a whole lot to smile about for a while.
Yeah, and so again, it's kind of interesting. It feels a little more like 2018. I think we can honestly say that. And
Yep,
so, if you're trying to figure out what that playbook looks like, go back and dust off the 2018 playbook, and it kind of feels like that. If the model holds. Now, again, we got to throw this disclaimer out there, right? This is based on economic data that we're feeding into these models. And so every month when we get new economic data, it can change the trajectory of that curve. And we have been getting a lot of revisions to a lot of the federal data that we use, John, and as you know better than I do, but you and I were talking off camera about some of those revisions have become pretty large. And it mostly has to do with a lot of challenges in new survey instruments and trying to figure out how to
sure.
best survey companies in the post-pandemic world and how to get people to respond to surveys. And so we've got a lot of volatility there. But again, we have to assume that that data is pretty accurate. And so based on that and the fact that we're using 20 different metrics and they kind of balance each other out, again, I think you can make that conclusion, at least for now, for fabricated metal products. Again, it feels like I almost said 1988, feels like 2018 all over again, right?
Yep,
I was thinking about the song like 1999, but
1999. Yeah, that just shows your age
it
too.
does show my age. It does. And yeah, a little worried about the mental acuity up there today. So
That's right. We're not going to go into that
we're not
one.
going to go into that. Yeah, that's a whole different video.
That's a whole different video. All right. Well, that concludes our look at industrial production for manufacturing and the main components of the supply chain feeding into it. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will talk again next month. Please take a look at our sector models because they're illuminating.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in, John, one last thing on the ASIS. I mean, it's $7 and you get all the models, you get the flagship report, price of a cup of coffee to keep you informed every single month. So if you don't already have a subscription, go get a free trial. It's 30 days. It's free. We don't take a credit card. Just go check it out and you get all this data and all this information. So, all right, now I'll say goodbye. All right, thanks everybody.
Take care.
Bye.